The winter of 1878 came down on the Northern Territories like a hammer on cold iron. It was not a season that arrived with gentle persuasion, with the soft gold of autumn leaves yielding gracefully to the first frost. Instead, it was an invasion. The cold did not knock before it entered. It kicked down the door. It was a tangible presence, a thief that stole the heat from your bones and the breath from your lungs. It lived in the drafts that snaked across the floorboards like icy serpents, and it whispered through the chinks in the log walls, a constant, mocking reminder of its power. For the small, isolated settlement huddled in the valley, this was the great and terrible rhythm of life. Survival was measured in cords of wood. Wealth was not counted in coin, but in the height of the woodpile stacked against the outer wall of a cabin. Every family knew the struggle. They fought the cold with the same methods their fathers and grandfathers had used before them. They stuffed the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and moss, a temporary truce that the wind would inevitably violate. They fed their cast-iron stoves with a relentless hunger, turning seasoned oak and maple into fleeting warmth and a column of smoke that stood stark against the pale, merciless sky. The cabins themselves were monuments to this traditional and ultimately failing struggle. They were built square and sturdy, sitting flat upon the earth, presenting their four walls to the wind like boxers with their guards up. Inside, the battle was constant. Frost would form on the heads of nails driven through the interior walls, glittering like cruel diamonds. A bucket of water left too far from the stove would be skimmed with ice by morning. The warmth was a small, besieged island in the center of the room, and the farther you moved from the stove, the more territory you ceded to the enemy. Children slept huddled together under piles of quilts and animal hides, their breath pluming in the frigid air of their own homes. This year, the old men said, was different. The signs were there for anyone who knew how to read them. The woolly caterpillars wore thicker coats. The squirrels had been frantic in their gathering, their caches impossibly large. The wind, even in early autumn, had a sharper edge, a more predatory bite. A sense of dread settled over the community with the first snows, a collective anxiety that was as palpable as the cold itself. They split more wood, they reapplied their mud and moss, they braced themselves for the siege. They were doing everything they had always done, only more of it, with a growing sense of desperation. They were reinforcing a failing strategy, digging in their heels on a battlefield where the enemy changed its tactics while they refused to change theirs. The cold was coming, and they prepared to fight it the only way they knew how, unaware that their methods were a declaration of a war they were destined to lose. In this community of hardened tradition lived Ilara. She had been a widow for 2 years, her husband, an engineer from a land of high mountains and deeper snows, taken by a fever the spring before last. He had been a quiet man, a reader of books filled with strange diagrams and calculations that the other men in the settlement found baffling and useless. Ilara was seen in much the same light, quiet, observant, and since her husband's passing, adrift. She was a slight woman, not built for the harsh labor of the territories, and the community watched her with a kind of pitying concern. They saw her and her 2 small children, Liam and Sophia, as vulnerable, a fragile flame that the coming winter would surely threaten to extinguish. As the rest of the settlement focused on their woodpiles and wall chinking, Ilara did something that, to everyone else, seemed utterly mad. She did not start by splitting logs. She did not mix mud and moss. Instead, she took up a shovel and a pickaxe and began to dig. Not for a root cellar, a small pit to store potatoes and carrots, but a vast, deep hole adjacent to her small cabin. Day after day she worked, her slight frame silhouetted against the graying sky. The rhythmic scrape of her shovel and the dull thud of the pickaxe became a source of curiosity, then confusion, and finally, mockery. The idea had come to her on a frigid night, as she sat watching her children sleep. She saw the frost creeping in from the corners of the room and remembered her husband's books. He had often spoken of the building methods of his homeland, not with arrogance, but with a quiet certainty. "We do not fight the earth," he used to say, his finger tracing a diagram of a house half buried in a hillside. "We ask for its help. The surface is where the weather lives. The surface is fickle, but deep down, the earth is constant. It holds the memory of summer." She had found his worn, leather-bound journal, filled with sketches of stone foundations, double walls, and something he called a thermal mass heater. The idea was not to build a fortress against the cold, but a shelter that drew strength from the very ground everyone else saw as a frozen, dead thing. She would dig below her cabin, creating a winter room, a sanctuary buffered by the deep, unwavering temperature of the earth itself. Thomas was the first to confront her. He was the settlement's most respected builder, a man whose cabins were known for their tight joints and straight lines. He considered himself an authority on the subject of shelter. He strode over to her property one afternoon, his hands on his hips, and stared down into the growing pit. "Woman," he began, his voice laced with a condescending certainty, "what do you think you are doing? A root cellar this size will collapse. The frost will get into the soil and heave your walls inward. You are digging a grave for your cabin, and maybe for your family." Ilara paused, resting her hands on the handle of the shovel. Her breath came in white puffs. "I am building a winter room, Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice even. Thomas let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A winter room? Down there? The coldest place will be the one closest to the frozen ground. It defies all common sense." He shook his head, a look of profound pity on his face. "You are wasting your strength. You should be splitting wood. That hole will not keep your children warm." His words, meant as a stern warning from a place of authority, spread through the settlement like a spark in dry grass. The mockery began in whispers, then grew into open jokes. Men would stop by on their way back from the forest, leaning on their axes and offering foolish advice. "Dig a bit deeper, Ilara, and you might strike a hot spring," one called out, followed by the laughter of his companions. Another suggested she was trying to tunnel her way to a warmer climate. Her project became known as Ilara's Folly. The women of the settlement would watch her from their windows, shaking their heads. They saw her as a woman unmoored by grief, clinging to the strange ideas of her foreign husband, ideas that were clearly dangerous in this practical, unforgiving land. The community, bound by their shared struggle, saw her deviation not as innovation, but as a foolish and tragic rebellion against the known realities of their world. The laughter did not deter her. The pity did not dissuade her. Ilara worked with a quiet, relentless diligence that bordered on obsession. Her children were the fuel for her fire. Every time she felt the ache in her back and shoulders, she would look at Liam and Sophia playing near the cabin, their small forms bundled in wool, and she would swing the pickaxe again. She was not just digging a hole, she was forging a shield. The scorn of her neighbors was a distant noise, drowned out by the fierce, protective love for her family and the quiet wisdom in her husband's books. Her days fell into a rhythm of grueling labor. She rose before the sun, when the air was so cold it felt sharp in her throat. She would light a small fire for the children, prepare a simple breakfast, and then descend into the deepening pit. The work was slow and punishing. The topsoil gave way to dense clay, and then to rocky earth that fought back against her tools. She learned the language of the ground, the way a certain color of soil meant rocks were near, the way a vein of sand meant easier digging. Her hands, once soft, became a roadmap of her effort, covered in calluses and blisters that broke and healed and formed again. She was not merely digging, she was engineering. She followed the diagrams from her husband's journal with the precision of a scholar. The walls of the pit were not vertical, but sloped gently outward at the base to relieve the pressure of the soil. When she reached the depth specified in the book, a full 10 feet below the frost line, she began the second phase, the foundation. She hauled field stones from the edge of the woods on a crude sledge, each one chosen for its flat faces and solid weight. She taught herself how to mix mortar from clay, sand, and ash, creating a crude but effective cement. She laid each stone with painstaking care, building a solid wall that rose from the floor of the pit. This was not the work of a week, but of a month, then another. Autumn began to fade, its colors bleeding from the trees, and still she worked. While Elara toiled in her pit of perceived madness, the rest of the community engaged in the familiar rituals of winter preparation. The air was filled with the sharp ring of axes on wood and the steady rasp of saws. Men worked in teams, their movements efficient and practiced, felling trees and hauling them back to the settlement. Their woodpiles grew into small mountains, monuments to their diligence. They patched their cabins, their movements quick and sure. They looked over at Elara, covered in dirt, hauling a single rock, and they saw futility. Their own work was quantifiable. They could count the logs, see the sealed cracks. Her progress was hidden in a hole in the ground. They were finishing their preparations. Hers seemed to have no end in sight. "She will be begging for firewood by the first blizzard," one man commented to Thomas, not unkindly. "It is a shame. Her husband was a strange fellow, but he was a hard worker. He would not have let her fall into such a fantasy." Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on Elara's solitary figure. "Grief makes people do strange things," he said, his voice low. "She is trying to hold on to him, I suppose, building his foreign dreams. But dreams do not stop the wind." He turned back to his own work, his resolve hardened. He was a practical man. He believed in what he could see and touch: thick logs, a roaring fire, a high stack of wood. He believed in the old ways because they had, for the most part, worked. They were difficult, they were imperfect, but they were known. Elara's folly was an insult to that hard-won knowledge. The true genius of her design was in the details that no one else could see. After the stone walls were complete, she began building a second inner wall of rough-hewn timber, leaving a gap of 6 inches between the stone and the wood. This was the part of the diagrams that had fascinated her husband the most, the principle of the still air gap. Into this space, she packed a thick insulation of dried moss, sawdust, and pine needles, materials the others saw as forest floor debris. To her, they were a crucial part of the system, a blanket to be wrapped around her stone core. Then came the heart of the winter room, the masonry heater. It was not a simple iron stove that burned hot and fast. It was a complex structure of brick and stone, with a long serpentine flue that snaked through a massive stone bench. The design was meant to capture every last bit of heat from a small, hot fire. The smoke would travel through the winding channels, its heat absorbed by the dense mass of the stone, before it finally escaped through a small chimney. The heater and the bench connected to it would not glow red-hot. Instead, they would radiate a gentle, consistent warmth for hours, even days, after the fire had died out. It was a thermal battery, storing heat the way a dam stores water. She built it herself, brick by laborious brick, her hands raw, her body aching, driven by a vision of a winter without shivering. The final step was to connect this subterranean sanctuary to the cabin above. She cut a hole in her floorboards, framed it carefully, and built a steep, sturdy ladder. She crafted a thick, insulated hatch door that fitted snugly into the opening. By the time the first heavy snows fell, blanketing the valley in a deep, silent white, she was done. From the outside, her cabin looked no different than any other, perhaps even a bit shabbier, with a woodpile that was noticeably smaller than her neighbor's. No one could see the 10-foot-deep, double-walled, stone-lined room beneath the floor. No one could see the massive masonry heater waiting patiently in the dark. They saw only the folly, and they waited for the cold to prove them right. The winter of 1878 did not just arrive, it attacked. It began with a week of heavy, relentless snow that buried the settlement up to the windowsills. Then, the sky cleared to a brilliant, cruel blue, and the temperature plummeted. The old-timers had never felt a cold so deep, so absolute. It was a dry, biting cold that seemed to leach the very life out of the air. The trees in the forest groaned and cracked with the frost, their branches shattering like glass. The river froze solid, its motion silenced under a thick sheet of ice. Then the wind came. It swept down from the northern peaks, a relentless, roaring force that scoured the landscape. It picked up the loose snow and turned the world into a churning, white chaos. This was not a storm. It was a physical assault. It howled like a legion of grieving ghosts, a sound that seeped through the thickest log walls and settled deep in the soul. For 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard raged without pause. The sun was a forgotten memory. The world shrank to the 4 walls of a cabin, and the only reality was the wind and the cold. Inside the traditional cabins of the settlement, life became a desperate, losing battle. The wind, like a master thief, found every minuscule crack, every poorly sealed joint. It drove fine, powdery snow through the walls, which collected in ghostly drifts on the floor. The heat from the iron stoves was sucked away almost as soon as it was produced. The stoves had to be fed constantly, their metal sides glowing a dangerous cherry red, while just a few feet away, the air was cold enough to see your breath. Families abandoned the outer rooms of their homes, huddling together in the small circle of warmth around the stove. They wore their outdoor clothes inside, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The constant, high-pitched scream of the wind was a torment, a sound that frayed the nerves and amplified the fear. The greatest fear was the woodpile. What had seemed like an inexhaustible mountain of fuel in autumn was now dwindling at an alarming rate. Men had to venture out into the blinding storm, risking frostbite and disorientation, to bring in more logs from the frozen stacks, each trip a small, terrifying war against the elements. Thomas, the master builder, felt the failure in his own home most acutely. His cabin, his masterpiece, felt as porous as a wicker basket. The wind mocked his craftsmanship. His wife coughed, a dry, shallow sound that tightened his chest with fear. He was burning through a week's worth of wood in a single day, and the cold was winning. In Ilara's cabin, the story was different. The main room upstairs was cold, there was no denying it. The wind howled outside her walls, just as it did everywhere else. But her battle was not being fought on that field. With the storm's arrival, she had moved her family, her children, their bedding, a small supply of food, down the ladder, through the insulated hatch, and into the winter room. When she closed the thick hatch door, the world changed. The roar of the wind diminished to a distant, muffled whisper. The air, which upstairs was a frantic, moving thing, became utterly still. There were no drafts. There was no seeping snow. There was only a profound and heavy silence, the silence of the deep earth. Earlier that day, she had built a small, hot fire in the masonry heater, using just a few split logs. The fire burned for 2 hours, and then she had let it die out. Now, the heater and the stone bench connected to it radiated a steady, gentle, pervasive warmth. It was not the scorching, aggressive heat of an iron stove, but a calm, constant presence that filled the entire space. The stone walls, buffered by the earth and the insulated air gap, did not radiate cold. They felt neutral to the touch. their chill stolen by the surrounding ground. The air temperature hovered at a steady 50 degrees. It was not warm enough for shirt sleeves, but it was a world away from the lethal cold above. It was an environment of pure, unassailable safety. Liam and Sophia, untroubled by the celestial battle raging above their heads, played quietly on a bearskin rug, their cheeks pink with health, not blue with cold. Ilara sat on the warm stone bench, mending a tear in her son's mitten, listening to the faint, muted sigh of the storm. She was not fighting the winter. She was nestled in the earth's embrace, and the winter could not touch her. The great blizzard lasted 4 full days. On the 5th morning, the settlement awoke to an unearthly silence. The wind was gone. The world outside was a pristine, sculpted landscape of white, buried under a snowpack so deep that it covered fences and reached halfway up the cabin doors. The sun rose in a sky of pale, washed-out blue, its light glittering on the immense drifts, a beauty that did little to warm the soul-deep chill that had settled over the community. The real crisis had just begun. The storm had broken, but the Arctic cold it had brought remained, locking the valley in its grip. Inside the cabins, the fight for warmth was more desperate than ever. The relentless burning of wood during the blizzard had decimated their fuel supplies. The cold had permeated the very logs of the walls, and now the cabins were bleeding heat faster than the stoves could produce it. Sickness began to spread, a rasping cough that echoed from house to house. Families were rationing firewood, letting their fires die down to embers at night, waking up to dangerously cold homes. The quiet of the settlement was the quiet of exhaustion and impending defeat. In Ilara's home, the contrast was absolute. The winter room remained a haven of stability. Her small store of firewood was barely touched. The masonry heater required only 1 small fire a day to keep the thermal mass charged and the room at a constant, livable temperature. Her children were healthy and calm. While her neighbors were contemplating the terrifying choice between freezing and running out of fuel, Ilara was rationing her food, not her firewood. She lived in a bubble of quiet security, a stark island of success in a sea of communal failure. Thomas was at his wits' end. His wife's cough had worsened, and his firewood pile was now a pathetic mound of scraps and splinters. He was a proud man, a man whose identity was built on his competence and skill. Now his pride felt like a fool's garment. He had built the strongest cabin in the valley, and it had failed. His expertise was a lie. In his desperation, a thought surfaced, one he had dismissed 100 times: Ilara's folly. He had not seen her asking for wood. He had not seen smoke from her chimney for days. A grim thought struck him. Perhaps the worst had happened. Consumed by a mixture of duty, guilt, and a sliver of morbid curiosity, he bundled himself against the cold and began the arduous trek through the deep snow to her cabin. He expected to find a house of ice, a tragedy locked in silence. He knocked on the door, his fist heavy. After a moment, the door opened a few inches. Ilara looked out, her face calm. What struck Thomas first was the air that flowed from the opening. It was not a blast of frigid, deathly cold, as he had expected. Nor was it the superheated, dry air of an overstoked stove. It was just still, neutral. "Mr. Thomas," she said, her voice even, "are you well?" He could not find his voice for a moment. Your chimney. There has been no smoke. I was worried." "We are well," she replied simply. "Please, come in." He stepped inside. The main room was chilly, as he'd expected, but there was no frost on the walls. The air lacked the biting, damp quality of his own home. He saw the square hatch in the middle of the floor. Ilara saw him looking at it. "We have been staying below," she said. She lifted the heavy door. A wave of air rose from the opening, air that was not hot, but unmistakably, impossibly, not cold. It was the air of a cool spring cellar, not the air of a grave in the heart of a frozen winter. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded. He descended the ladder, his boots finding the rungs in the dim light. As his head dropped below the level of the floor, he felt it. The change was instantaneous and profound. The oppressive, life-sapping cold vanished, replaced by a calm, steady coolness that felt more like a gentle embrace. At the bottom, he stood and looked around. His eyes, accustomed to the harsh glare of the snow, slowly adjusted. He saw the two children, playing with carved wooden figures on a rug. They were not bundled in layers of wool. They wore simple indoor clothes. He saw the massive stone and brick structure against one wall. He reached out a trembling hand and touched its side. It was not hot, but it was distinctly warm, radiating a deep, penetrating heat that felt ancient and alive. He touched the stone wall of the room itself. It was cool, but it was the cool of a cave, not the soul-stealing cold of a frozen log. The temperature was, as he would later describe it, the temperature of absolute peace. He stood there in the center of Ilara's folly, the master builder, the voice of tradition and common sense, and understood with crushing certainty that everything he thought he knew about survival was wrong. He was wrong. Ilara did not gloat. There was no trace of triumph in her eyes, no hint of "I told you so" in her voice. She simply descended the ladder after him, holding 2 tin cups. She handed one to him. It was filled with warm, savory broth. The warmth spread through his chilled hands, a small, simple act of hospitality that felt like a profound lesson in grace. "How?" Thomas finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. He gestured around the room, at the walls, the heater, the impossible comfort. Ilara took a seat on the warm stone bench. "The earth holds the memory of summer," she said softly, the words a near-perfect echo of what her husband had once told her. "The iron stove fights the winter. It is a loud, hungry, and wasteful fight. This," she patted the stone beside her, "this does not fight. It remembers. It holds. The earth gives us its constancy, if we are wise enough to ask for it." Her triumph was not in her victory over his skepticism, but in the quiet, undeniable truth of the warm air on his face. It was in the healthy flush on her children's cheeks. It was in the simple, profound fact that her method worked, while his had failed. He drank the broth in silence, the warmth spreading through his body, extinguishing the last embers of his pride and replacing them with a nascent, humbling sense of awe. Thomas emerged from Ilara's cabin like a man returning from a pilgrimage. He stumbled back through the snow to his own cold, failing home, his mind reeling. He looked at his glowing stove, devouring wood with a frantic hunger, and saw it for what it was, a desperate, temporary measure. He looked at his wife, shivering under a pile of blankets, and the shame was a physical weight. He did not keep the discovery to himself. He first told his wife, who listened with disbelief, then with a flicker of hope. Then he went to his nearest neighbor, a man whose children were sick with the same cough. "You must go to the widow's house," Thomas said, his voice stripped of all its former authority, now filled with an urgent sincerity. "You must go below." The news spread through the frozen settlement like a slow-moving current. It was met first with stark disbelief. Thomas, the proudest and most knowledgeable builder among them, admitting his own failure and praising the very folly he had mocked? It seemed impossible. But desperation was a powerful motivator. The first neighbor went, then another. They came in ones and twos, their faces grim with skepticism, and they left with the same look of stunned wonder that Thomas had worn. The path to Ilara's cabin became packed down as more and more people made the journey. They came to witness the miracle for themselves. They descended the ladder into the winter room and stood in the calm, steady air. They touched the warm stone of the heater. They saw Ilara's healthy children. The jokes about Ilara's folly died on their lips, replaced by a heavy, respectful silence. The laughter that had echoed through the autumn was gone, and in its place was the quiet sound of a community realizing its own profound ignorance. They had been shouting instructions at the storm, while Ilara had been listening to the wisdom of the earth. A few days later, Thomas returned to Ilara's cabin. He did not come seeking warmth or shelter this time. He came carrying a small, smoothed piece of slate and a lump of charcoal. He found Ilara outside, splitting a small log with practiced, efficient swings. She stopped as he approached. He did not waste words on apologies or pleasantries. He held up the slate and charcoal, his expression one of complete humility. "Teach me," he said. The two words were heavy with meaning. It was the master acknowledging a superior knowledge. It was the voice of the community admitting its error. It was a plea for a new kind of wisdom. Ilara did not hesitate. She did not remind him of his mockery or his condescension. She simply nodded, laid down her axe, and led him inside. She brought out her husband's worn journal, its pages filled with elegant script and precise, beautiful diagrams. She opened it on the simple wooden table, and the lesson began. She shared her knowledge as freely and generously as she had offered him the cup of broth. She explained the principles, her voice clear and steady. She talked about the frost line and how the earth below it maintains a stable temperature year-round. She explained thermal mass, the ability of dense materials like stone and brick to absorb and slowly release heat. She traced the path of the flue in the diagram of the masonry heater, showing him how it was designed to extract the maximum amount of energy from the minimum amount of fuel. She spoke not as a victor, but as a simple conduit for the knowledge that had saved her family. Thomas, the master builder, sat and listened, his calloused hands carefully copying the diagrams onto his slate, a student learning the first letters of a language he never knew existed. When the long winter finally relinquished its grip and the valley thawed under the tentative warmth of the spring sun, the settlement was transformed. The sound that filled the air was not just the cheerful noise of a community emerging from hibernation, but the determined sound of rebuilding. It started with Thomas. He began digging next to his own cabin, his movements now guided by a new understanding. He was not digging a grave for his home, but a new foundation for its future. Others followed his lead. The sight of men digging deep, square pits beside their cabins became common. Ilara's folly was now Ilara's method. The men who had once leaned on their axes and offered jokes now came to her with sincere questions about mortar mixes and stone selection. She would walk from site to site, her husband's journal in hand, offering quiet advice and pointing out details from the diagrams. She became the settlement's most unlikely and most respected engineer. That spring and summer, the entire architecture of the community began to change. New homes were built, and old ones were retrofitted, with deep, stone-lined winter rooms. The skyline was altered by the appearance of stout, efficient masonry chimneys. The landscape was dotted with the new, deep foundations, a testament to a hard-learned lesson. The story of the settlement that survived the great winter of 1878 traveled beyond the valley. Traders and trappers passing through the following year were astonished by the new building style. They saw cabins with modest wood piles that were warmer and safer than the small forts they were used to. They heard the story of the quiet widow who listened to the earth, and they carried that story with them to other settlements, other territories. The idea, born of a foreign engineer's knowledge and a desperate mother's love, began to spread, a quiet revolution of stone and soil. It was a legacy passed on not in grand speeches or monuments, but in the simple, life-giving warmth of a well-built home. Years later, when the settlement had grown into a proper town, its homes famously warm and its people famously resilient against the harshest winters, the story of Alara was still told. She never sought praise or position. She lived out her days in her small cabin, her children grew, and she remained a quiet, humble member of the community she had saved. But her true monument was all around. It was in the foundations of every house. It was in the healthy faces of the children who no longer had to fear the winter. The community had learned more than just a new way to build. They had learned that the most valuable wisdom is often found in the quietest voices. They learned that tradition, when it becomes a wall against new ideas, is not a source of strength, but a prison. And they learned that true resilience is not about fighting nature with brute force, but about having the humility to understand it and the wisdom to work with it as an ally. The earth, as Alara had shown them, would always offer its strength to those who were willing to listen.